So first of all, thank you for inviting me and thank you for organizing this great meeting. I will speak about insomnia and emotional memory. If you look at the video on the left, you see that there is things going on in the brain during sleep. We all know that. And if you look at that sleeping baby, you might even imagine that emotionally relevant memories might go on during sleep. The figure on the right is a figure from a fairy tale. I don't know if you recognize it. Yes, yeah, it's the princess on the P. And I like this illustration because this is about insomnia. And at least in the Netherlands, insomnia has long been seen as only, let's say, it's all in the head. So people just have to relax and then, you know, go to sleep and that's it. And working on insomnia, I think this is really a misunderstanding. It would be like telling a person with depression just to cheer up and be happy, or someone with Alzheimer just not to forget so much and remember everything. So in my team, what we try to do is try to get an understanding of the insomniac brain, what's going on really. So it's all in the head. We think it's all in the head, but then literally, rather than in the saying that it's just only psychological disorder. I came from a long way. I studied mostly circadian rhythms, so day-night rhythms, how they were organized by the biological clock in the hypothalamus. And for long I tried to find what was wrong with the biological clock in people with insomnia, and I never found anything. So I will not speak about that. That cost me years. But we got some other nice findings, and I will present them here. So a bit of background. For those of you who are not familiar with it, insomnia disorders or insomnia disorder is very prevalent. About 7% of the population, this is a conservative estimate, have persistent sleep complaints with daytime consequences. And that's sort of the diagnosis in brief. So that makes it the second most prevalent mental disorder in Europe. It's moreover a primary risk factor for depression and anxiety, and it's also highly comorbid with depression and anxiety. And there already, again, there seems to be this link with maybe emotion regulation. I'm trying to find out in an EOC advanced grant who among the people with insomnia will develop a depression or anxiety disorder and who will not. But it's a very tough subject to separate, and this will be my last slide as well. So what is insomnia? Just a few remarks on what it is and what it's not. So I told you already, I studied the biological clock of the brain in people with insomnia and couldn't find anything there. So what can we, if we just observe sleep in insomnia, what can we see? This here is a graph showing that insomnia is at least sleep stage instability. This is a graph comparing good sleepers with people with insomnia and then showing how the probability to go from one sleep stage to another sleep stage differs between good sleepers and people with insomnia. So people with insomnia are more likely, if they are in REM sleep or in stage 1 sleep or in stage 2 sleep, to move back to wakefulness. Also, if they're in stage 2 sleep, they're moving back to stage 1 sleep more than good sleepers do. And if they are awake, you know, the wake state tends to continue. This difference is most marked in REM sleep. Also within a sleep stage, so within a 30-second or 20-second epoch, there seems to be instability. This upper polysomnogram shows in color throughout the night, going from awake stage 1, 2, 3 and REM sleep in red in a good sleeper. This is an example of an insomniac. You see that there is a lot of sleep, so the name insomnia is actually not well chosen, because there is a lot of red, green and blue indicating there is a lot of sleep. But within these stages, you see these brief arousals. They're shown here. They're just a few seconds of arousals. In the zoom in on the right, you see what an arousal can look like. So there is instability of sleep stages, but also within a sleep stage, there is this tendency to always go to a sort of wake-like state. And again, it's most marked in REM sleep. So it happens everywhere, but if you look for where is it worst, and that's in REM sleep. And this resembles, in fact, PTSD, where also this REM sleep is very fragmented, very much troubled by arousals. Another characteristic of insomnia that is very reproducible is sleep state misperception. So, in brief, this is that people overestimate the time that they spend awake when they are actually sleeping, according to the polysomnogram. So I tend to believe people with insomnia better than the polysomnogram, because polysomnography is a very old-fashioned method to just determine whether someone is conscious or not. And as Francesca beautifully demonstrated, this is handbook knowledge that's not true. So this is a distribution, a histogram of the difference between objective and subjective wakefulness in good sleepers. And you see that is, on average, there's no difference. They distribute around 0, so they know how much they have been awake during the night. This is a histogram of people with insomnia. It's from Marconi, a 9-year-ago paper, but many people demonstrated this. The whole curve is shifted. So people overestimate the time awake between some minutes up till hours. People can think they are awake for hours, while the polysomnogram suggests that they're asleep. If you try to understand who are the ones with the worst misperceptions, are the ones at the right here, it seems to be correlated with, again, these REM arousals. So they somehow seem important. And we also found that more REM arousals generate more thought-like than dream-like mental content. So, a further observation is that insomnia is not restricted to the night. So it's not a disorder that you have at night and then you wake up and it's over. If we measure wake EEG with high density, we see that people with insomnia show less alpha activity than controls. This is the group difference. So this sort of idling or inhibitory signal of alpha is less present in insomnia. They also can show too much excitatory activity, so that's beta over there up till maybe gamma. Again, insomnia controls and the difference, and it's all over. So it continues during wakefulness, that sort of hyper-aroused state, and again, it's much like post-traumatic stress disorder. It's also associated with what we call enhanced processing. So people complain that they are easily distracted. And this is, I think, a nice observation that we did. We have every heartbeat, every signal from our body is processed by the brain. And that allows us to make a heartbeat evoke potential. So we have to get rid of the artifact. But if we can get rid of the artifact, we can record that the brain records every heartbeat. So this is the time that the heart beats, and this is then the curve you can find. It's a very small amplitude, it's not very nice, but we can find it. And usually after about 400 milliseconds, this is controls in blue, there is no processing anymore. And that makes sense, because after 400 milliseconds, you usually process things that are relevant and need attention, not the things that are sort of automated and you can skip. But we see in people with insomnia, so the red curve, that they continue to process every heartbeat, also in with a later potential. So indicating as if they pay attention to every heartbeat. And if you look at where that comes from, we try to estimate that, source estimation from the high density. EEG, we see that it involves the medial prefrontal cortex, which we know is involved in paying attention to important stuff. So you can imagine that it's very it's a demanding disorder. So then finally, this is something we tried also to. Of course, for most disorders, it's nice to have a model to have healthy subjects and then induce the problem and then deduct or have better conclusions. But sleep deprivation is not at all a good model for insomnia. And just briefly, this is Nico, one of my former PhD students. He's awake for, I think, about 40 hours here. He's looking at the monitor, trying to respond to stimuli on the TV. And you see that what happens with his eyes rolling, he's just dozing off to a brief state of sleep. More people are familiar with doing that outside of the lab. For example, you're really tired, you drive home, and then suddenly a tree crosses the road and you hadn't seen it and you bump into it. So this is sleep deprivation. It's a very, well, people know about this. It lowers arousal, and if you're allowed to sleep again after that, sleep will be deep and continuous. In insomnia, it's actually the reverse. It's not even no low arousal, they are hyper-aroused. So it's subjective, it's in physiology, it's in wake EEG, and it's also in sleep EEG. So it's not at all like sleep deprivation, and if it's like something, it's more like PTSD. They're hyper-aware, hyper-aroused 24 hours a day. So after this description of the phenomenology, I can sort of conclude that people with insomnia fail to disengage from distress. It seems as if they are distressed all the time. That's the profile that they show in central and autonomic measures. As if they're watchful and hyper-aroused all the time. And yeah, that seems so much like PTSD, and that made us go after lingering maladaptive associations to link it to learning and unlearning specific things. So we went into emotional memory and insomnia, to see whether that could play a role, whether there was something wrong there with getting rid of emotional distress. And just briefly to explain what I mean with emotional memory. So I think the most common way of thinking about emotional memory is, that, for example, this kind of task. You present a series of words: snail, cat, dog, and then with the word dog you shock people, or you do a similar experiment with animals, and then you wait for a long time and you see how well the recall is of these different words, and the recall for dog will be probably be best. And that is because you induce distress, and with distress I mean activation of amygdala, locus coeruleus, anterior cingulate cortex, hypothalamus, autonomic activity, cortisol, etc. So a general state of distress. If that happens during presentation of a stimulus, then the recall of that stimulus will just be better. It's a very well-known thing of increased arousal, better memory. But this is not what I mean if I go into the details of our studies. Because there is something else that I think is really important, and especially with respect to, for example, PTSD. There's another kind of memory as well. So what happens here is that there is just this plain remembering of the word dog that is better in this specific healthy subject. But in other people, for example, people with PTSD, presenting that word will again induce the distress that happened here, or sometimes even worse. So with emotional memory, as I discuss it here, it is about things that you don't adapt to, that again keep on triggering that whole full expression of distress, including central and autonomic measures. And I think this is a much more relevant way of looking at emotional memory. Of course, this is emotional memory, but I'll discuss this type of emotional memory because it's more relevant. And as I see it, the memory traces, in this case of the word dog, they include maladaptive associations. They include activation of that whole system of distress. So then the question is, how do we normally get rid of a stuck emotional memory? Well, this is a big problem, also in treatment of PTSD. But this is a general thinking about it. So there is somehow this synaptic contacts that represent that dog has been associated with distress. And if the word dog sounds, there will be this distress. Now, quite some researchers have tried to interfere with that synaptic connection, and they found this paradigm. If they present that fear-eliciting stimulus, dog, for example, but in a very strange context, a very unexpected context. I try to phrase it here that there is something happening, like, what a nice dog. So there is the word dog again, but it's in a very different context. It's not expected. Some people call it prediction error. What happens then is that this synapse can become labile temporarily. So that provides an opportunity to reset that direct connection between dog and distress. And then if we do nothing, we just wait, we'll find that there will be reconsolidation, so it didn't help. So that synapse is restabilized, and there is again this direct connection between dog and eliciting distress. And that is probably because there is noradrenaline around all the time in our brain, and if synapses become labile, then noradrenaline is around and restabilizes the synapse. That's a bit too fast. So there is a protocol that has been replicated several times and seems effective many times, where instead, so there is this connection, and then there is this unexpected presentation of that fearful stimulus in a different context, synaptic labelization. And then if you give propranolol, so you block whatever noradrenaline is doing with synapses, then you can sort of long-term depotentiate that connection. So this is all very schematic. Of course, there is no synapse connecting the word with another state, but just to give you an impression how that works. But I think the bottom line of what I try to explain is that unexpected associations plus a timeout from noradrenaline can help us forget these emotional memories. This is the bottom line of what I wanted to convey. Now, if you think about that and we go back to sleep, then we know that REM sleep, this is very old material. Gary Aston Jones published this in 1981. This is locus coeruleus activity, multi-unit activity recorded here. This is EEG signal. This is EMG, so muscle tone. And this is just the continuation of the recording, and then here. So you see that locus coeruleus is active basically all the time, both during wakefulness and slow wave sleep. And then only when the animal goes into REM sleep, which is about here, then there is a complete absence of locus coeruleus activity until the animal gets out of REM sleep, back to wakefulness, and there is locus coeruleus activity again. So the experiment that I just showed with giving propranolol, to give people a timeout of noradrenaline, is something that we get for free every night, and only during REM sleep. So REM sleep is the only state during which the brain is temporarily without noradrenaline. During all other states, the brain is flooded in noradrenaline. So this is just a summary of that to show that there is here this paradoxical sleep, this is slow wave sleep, this is wakefulness, here is wakefulness. And this is what happens then with noradrenaline in the brain. And then the question is, for me, what happens in people with insomnia, but also, for example, in people with PTSD? Because their REM sleep is not restless. They have these brief arousals all the time that indicate that locus coeruleus activity is not completely missing. It's popping up all the time. So people with insomnia and people with PTSD, they miss that period of time that's really without noradrenaline. So what would be the consequences of that? And this is just explaining to you that what happens during REM sleep in humans is that certain areas are deactivated, especially prefrontally, for example. And we think this is really involved in accepting any bizarre association that pops up. There is not our prefrontal controller that directs possibilities in associations that could be allowed and could not be allowed. Locus coeruleus immediately activates especially first these prefrontal areas and parietal areas. And we could think about what would happen with deactivation of these areas during REM sleep. If noradrenaline would reappear during REM sleep, then the cortex becomes more like awake cortex. And it's conceivable that instead of experiencing dreams with all the bizarreness and all those weird associations, that whatever people experience subjectively is more like thoughts. And this is something that we went after. What you find in this slide is we had about 36 people in which we recorded, this was actually a collaboration with another lab, recorded the number of REM-specific arousals. So this is the ratio of the number of arousals in REM sleep relative to overall arousals. These are 36 different people. And we asked them also about their nocturnal mentation. So did you dream a lot? Did you tell a lot about your dreams? And did you, same questions repeated, did you think a lot? Did you tell people about what you thought at night, etc.? And we see that the more REM arousals occur, which we interpret as more noradrenaline during REM sleep, the more people tend to say that they have thoughts during the night rather than dreams during the night. So this is a sort of suggestion that indeed the REM-specific arousals sort of tend to increase how much you experience sleep as being awake and without dreams. So this is in 32 people, but then we have this questionnaire as a sort of proxy measure for REM sleep specific fragmentation and noradrenergic activity. And then we can just give that questionnaire to many, many people. We did it through internet, so we have 1,200 people. And we found that this has consequences for how long people feel distressed if they have a distressing experience. And we asked them how often does it happen that you take that distress or feeling distress to tomorrow, to day after tomorrow, to next week, to next month, or even to several months. And we see this clear association that the more people have this wake-like thoughts during the night, which we think may have to do with noradrenergic activity, the more they take distress to the next day. It's specific also, because if we ask people, what about short-lasting distress? So do you take distress to the next 5 minutes, or half an hour, or a few hours? As long as it's within a day, there is no association at all. So this is specifically taking distress to tomorrow and the next days. So sleep is in between. So given these really indirect, I have to admit that you already recognized it probably, all these indirect associations, we thought, well, we were not very successful in explaining insomnia by biological clock mechanisms or whatever. Let's do experimental studies on the role of restless REM sleep on maybe insufficient overnight adaptation of distress. Because if that would be true, then you would have a model that distress just continues and people get in this hyper-aroused state and it's around there 24 hours a day. So a brief intermezzo on how to experimentally induce emotions, and I was new to field of emotion, and I noticed that 99% of the people that study emotions, they use the International Affective Picture System, and they show a picture like this here. And I ask you if you feel your heart pound, your hands sweat, your stomach contract. Not me, to be honest. When I saw this picture, it reminded me of a good night out a long time ago, a nice movie that I once saw. So I was sort of happy. I got happy associations with this picture. Well, it was supposed to give me fear. And I discussed this with a psychologist because of a collaboration I had to do with a psychoanalyst. And he was surprised. He said, "Why would you use these pictures, because they are so clinically irrelevant. You know, there's no one in my clinical practice where these kind of things are the problem." And he explained to me that what we would better do is look at self-conscious emotions. And I didn't know what that meant, self-conscious emotions. But these are things like feeling guilty and feeling ashamed and embarrassed. The positive side of it is pride, for example. But especially these negative things, embarrassment, shame, guilt, I learned from that therapist that it would be much better to immediately study that. But that gives the next problem. How do you induce a self-conscious emotion and do that in a way that it passes the IRB, the Medical Ethics Committee? And we found a nice way to do that. So this is what we wanted to do, just back to what the sort of experiments and the sort of hypothesis we had. And this was actually our first experiment. So we want to induce a distressing stimulus. And you see the pounding heart, there is something really distressing here. Then let people sleep. And then we think that if there is consolidated REM sleep, that may help. You know, it's like the inbuilt propranolol, the inbuilt noradrenaline-free period that we have. It will help to extinct distress if we present it again the next day. Now, how to induce that distress? And we had a real nice way of doing that. So what we did is we asked people to sing along with a karaoke recording. They had big muffles on their ears, so they could not hear themselves. They only heard the other perfect singers and loud music, and then they sang along. But they could not correct, because they didn't hear themselves very well, they could not correct their pitch or if they were out of sync with the singing. And then we recorded that and we played it back to them individually without any accompanying music or other singers later. And I can tell you, I was the first guinea pig, and we were discussing whether we would need, for example, galvanic skin response. And I said, Rick, who is the one who did the experiments, it's not necessary, because you can just film the sweat that's in the palms of my hand. I'll try to play it. I hope it works.
Stille Nacht, heilige Nacht, David zo lang verwacht.
So, I don't know what you think of it, but even listening, this was not me, I would not dare to do that. This was Rick, actually the PhD student who did the studies. Even listening to Rick still gives me embarrassment, because it's so, and then imagine that it's yourself. You really feel that, and we see that galvanic skin response and everything. So then we do that in the evening, and we do it again in the next morning, and we control the experiment also for morning to evening, and morning to the next day, evening to the next evening, etc. And what we find is that in good sleepers, as we had expected, there is this drop. So from the evening to the morning, it's not as bad to listen again. So you just sort of decide, well, it's not in tune, it's out of sync, but, well, who cares? It's not as shameful anymore. In people with insomnia, much to our surprise, it's not a flat line that they have that sleep doesn't work. It seems as if sleep even makes it worse. As if something that should be erased is actually, by that restless sleep, boosted instead of suppressed. So this was the first experiment that we did, and we wanted to continue on that. So we took people to the MRI scanner, and we played the embarrassing singing in the evening, and again the next morning, with again the idea that sound REM sleep will help you get rid of the distress, and fragmented REM sleep might even boost or interfere with getting rid of it. And what you see here is what happened with amygdala activation elicited by the stimulus, and then the difference, so the decrease overnight in amygdala activation from the evening to the next morning. So this is just in general where the amygdala is and how it decreased. And we found that the time spent in REM sleep determined how much decrease in amygdala activation there was. So the more REM, the more you forget of this emotionally distressing response, including in the amygdala. So people that have very little time in REM, there is very little change in the amygdala. But now here's the kicker. This decrease is specifically so when REM sleep is minimally interrupted by arousals. So if people have arousals during their REM sleep, so if their REM sleep is restless, the association sort of shifts, sort of flips over, so that the people that have the most interrupted REM sleep, they tend to end at the other side of zero. So that you'd better have no REM sleep than restless REM sleep if you want to get rid of distress. Then we took the next step and thought, well, people with insomnia do not have insomnia for one night. Usually it's for months, for many months, and in many people it's during their lifetime. So it's a vulnerability, and there are only few insomniacs that have insomnia for 3 months, so have the diagnosis, and then they're treated and it's over for a lifetime. There are very few. Usually it's for very long. So we took a next experiment where we gave people the new distress, and we also asked them with a specific protocol to go back to embarrassing experiences, really embarrassing, shameful experience of long ago, of 10 years ago, 20 years ago, 30 years ago. And what we found in controls, if you induce new distress, as I just showed, amygdala activation is also there, but I highlight this part here because it's where we find the changes. There is anterior cingulate cortex activation. But if you then ask the same people to go back to really embarrassing experiences in their early life, there is not this activation of the anterior cingulate cortex anymore. And PFC may control it. If you do the same in people with insomnia, so this is the novel distress, and they respond more, they have a wider brain response to novel distress, but again including anterior cingulate cortex. But if we ask them to go back to real old embarrassing experience, 10, 20, 30 years ago, they activate their anterior cingulate cortex as if it just happened. As if they never, also not in the long term, really got rid of that, let's say, the activation, the limbic activation associated with this memory. Okay, so these were the behavioral and MRI experiments that we did, and just in the last slide I want to show a little bit about how we think emotion regulation may be key in insomnia. And this is from another angle. We know that there is heritability of insomnia, and in females it's very strong. It's 59%. So in males, it's about average, so most of the things have some heritability. It's a complex trait, so it's not a single gene that's involved, but there is this heritability. And then we started to do genome-wide association studies on why is insomnia heritable. And we found many genes that are associated with insomnia. But then if you look at the association or the risk genes for insomnia and how they overlap with other problems that people can experience, we see that they resemble, so risk gene variants for insomnia resemble risk gene variants for anxiety disorders, depressive symptoms, neuroticisms, and major depressive disorder diagnosis. Most. So it seems as if the vulnerability to develop insomnia genetically is very much overlaps with the vulnerability to develop depression and to develop anxiety disorder. We took it one step further. We had a second genome-wide association study now in 1.3 million people. And because you have so many people, your statistical power increases, and we found more than 500 genes that had small contributions to that risk of insomnia. And I don't show this to go through the genes one by one. I don't think this is a good way to do it. I show it because it gives, if you have so many genes that have some involvement, maybe in insomnia, this allows you to go to databases and to look up where are these genes used, because not all cells in the body and brain use all genes ever in their lifetime. So we did that with GTEx and Karolinska Institute for tissue expression and cell type expression. This is how it works. So suppose we have this list of genes where variants are associated with insomnia. It goes on along. And we have a specific cell type X where none of these genes is ever used. Then we can maybe safely state that this cell is not involved in the risk, genetic risk of insomnia, because it doesn't use that genes. For this cell, Y, which expresses a lot of these insomnia risk genes, it's much more probable that it could have to do with insomnia. So we did that using these large databases, and this is what we found. Indeed, there were a few areas in the brain that showed statistically significant, after all the corrections, associations with genetic risk for insomnia. And I think the interesting thing is there were only 2 cortical areas that were involved, and one again was the anterior cingulate cortex. So it seems to be as if there may be some kind of sensitivity there to things not going well. What was more interesting for us, probably, was that colostrum pyramidal cells, which are known to project heavily to the anterior cingulate cortex, were also expressing a lot of insomnia risk genes. And here it becomes really interesting, because I told you that during REM sleep, many of the prefrontal areas are sort of deactivated, but there is this exception. The anterior cingulate cortex is activated during REM sleep. And the underlying cause of that is because colostrum pyramidal cells send their projections to the anterior cingulate, and specifically during REM sleep activate that area. So what we have here is sort of converging support for the idea that there may be a system involving locus coeruleus, anterior cingulate cortex, and activation of anterior cingulate cortex during REM sleep. So this is a sort of summary and model, so what we are after and how we would like to continue. There is these risk gene variants that put you at risk of insomnia. We also know that childhood adversity put you at risk of insomnia. So these are the usual suspects for almost everything, you know, risk genes and early life stress. This is an interesting observation because childhood adversity increases the probability to have restless sleep. And this is not yet insomnia. It's just the type of restless REM sleep that I discussed. And we have started with polygenic risk scores and look at healthy young volunteers to see what happens to their sleep. And also their sleep is becoming restless. So these are two things that increase the probability to have this kind of restless sleep, and maybe you miss the timeout from noradrenaline. And the idea is that if that happens, and it's supported by a model that we presented in PNAS, maybe that doesn't help you to dissolve the stress over the night, a process that you normally get for free with the propranolol-like REM states. And gradually, you know, then there may be a trigger, a first event, and then you really cannot get rid of the distress anymore, and you're sort of caught or stuck in that loop of not getting rid of distress. So this is the model where we will continue to work on. And that raises the question whether insomnia is a sleep disorder or maybe more a disorder of emotional memory. And then I want to close with sort of summary of discussions I had with psychiatrists. I'm in the psychiatry department 1 day a week. And this is 3 patients and 3 different diagnoses, of course. So the first patient sleeps poorly, feels upset during the day, and therefore often avoids social obligations and feels restless. And that's why, of course, she was diagnosed with insomnia disorder. The second patient avoids social contacts, feels restless and upset, and sleeps poorly, and that was, of course, why he was diagnosed with anxiety disorder. And the third patient feels upset and restless, sleeps poorly, and withdraws from social contacts, and that's why she was diagnosed with depression. So I don't know if you see it, but it's so, what comes first? So this is to acknowledge my team. I have a great team of young, enthusiastic people who make long days. I was very lucky with getting funding for this, and we would like to continue this and hope to get forward with understanding insomnia and its role in anxiety and depression. Thank you.